Venezuela itself is a bundle of orthodoxies that are waiting for us to push a stake through them. What do you think should be the first one we begin with?
The first orthodoxy should be the idea that Putin and Xi are going to be really scared as a result of what happened. And we saw a lot of commentators, especially in Europe where we live, come to that conclusion that this is really bad for dictators everywhere in the world. That is an orthodoxy, and it is completely wrong. This was a breach of international law, irrespective of the fact that Maduro was a dictator. That has nothing to do with it. International law does not make no distinction between whether the person who runs the country is democratically elected or not. It's not our choice to make. It validates Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which was done with the same argument. We need Ukraine, just as Trump needs Venezuela. And we will talk later about why Trump may need Venezuela. But the argument that you capture a country just because you need it or because you think you have an historic claim on it, as in the case of Russia or in the case of China. So I don't think it will impact, say, the Taiwan situation in the short run, but it will certainly legitimize it in terms of the public discourse. It will make it possible for Putin and Xi to say with some credibility that, look, what we're doing is what you're doing. It will be harder for anybody to condemn it, except for Europeans, to condemn it morally, because it set a precedent. But what is really important now, that we are returning to this sort of 1950s, 60s, 70s era, Cold War era, of spheres of influence, the old Henry Kissinger view of foreign policy. He was no friend of the Soviet Union, but he respected the Soviet Union's sphere of influence, just as the Soviet Union respected the United States' sphere of influence. The sphere of influence of the United States is the Western Hemisphere, as it was clearly stated in the US National Security Strategy, which was published just before Christmas. That was the priority for the United States. And when people say Trump isn't strategic about this, I'm not so sure. There may be a lot of transactional, opportunistic moments involved, but this is certainly in line with that strategy, that he wants to take control of the Western Hemisphere politically. Canada, especially Greenland, are probably next. It does not mean that Trump will engage in Ukraine or step up the aid of Ukraine. It does not mean that should China were to invade Taiwan, that Trump would necessarily push back against that. This is why I think it is ultimately good news for the dictators of the East, because it strengthens their position, it strengthens the argument, but more importantly, it signals to them that the sphere of influence era is back and that they stand there to exploit it.
Wolfgang, when I heard of Maduro's abduction, I tweeted something like along the lines of, what a great day for Vladimir Putin. I can imagine him in the Kremlin, sipping a bit of vodka and smoking a cigar, watching Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union, and Keir Starmer, the United Kingdom, playing dumb, while Trump is trashing what is left of international law, which isn't much. The Western media reporting Maduro's abduction as an arrest. And I can imagine Putin, that's what I tweeted, saying, wow, I have Putinized the United States and the West. They do not even pretend to respect international law. Not that the West ever respected international, but they pretended to do so. They tried to find excuses for whatever interventions they made. Now, I'll take your point about the strategic realignment that is occurring these days in the first few days of 2026 very seriously. Now, let us remind our audience that I think it was the 14th of October 2019 when Fiona Hill, who used to be an official in the National Security Council, was testifying to Congress. And at some point she mentioned something, and I think that verbatim she said, that during the negotiations and discussions with Russian officials, the Russian officials had suggested a very strange swap. Their Monroe Doctrine for ours. That's how she put it. And what she meant was that the Russian officials, Putin's officials, were suggesting to Trump 1.0, that you can have your Monroe Doctrine, that is complete hegemony over the Western, the Americas, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas. So effectively, you take Venezuela and you let us do whatever we want in our backyard, which is Ukraine. And I think that this is exactly what Putin is looking forward to. And I think with good cause, he thinks that Trump is going to go for something like that. Maybe he didn't have what it took to do it in 2017, 2018. But, Putin has every reason to rejoice. And, what that really upsets me is the European loyalists and the nationalist Ukrainians who, in the fog of war, I understand them. But what I don't understand is the manner in which they become ballistic when they hear you or me saying these things and say, oh, but are you telling us that Putin never cared about international law? No, we're not telling you that. He never gave a damn about international law. He violated it by invading Ukraine. What we're saying is that now he's exceptionally happy that the West has stopped talking about international law and demonizing him. And this is his way of Putinizing the West.
And the European reaction was absolutely appalling. You heard Kaja Kallas, the representative, the high representative for foreign security policy. She said the EU was closely monitoring the situation. I heard the German foreign minister saying the situation in Venezuela is complex, as he put it. They're just all over the place, these people. They haven't got a strategy. And, if and when, I believe the Greenland thing will happen, if and when this happens, they will not have a strategy. They are dependent on the United States. The reason they kowtowing to them over military, they gave in on trade. The EU is weak. It shows at one point in its past, during the Eurozone crisis, when you were, during the period when you were in government, it shows in that period not to form a political union. That was a choice. All the people who mattered thought at the time this was the smart choice to make. But this is the price to be paid. If you don't have a political union, the centralized EU can't keep up with the Putins of this world and with the Trumps of this world. It's being played. The relationship is one of total dependency, and yet nobody likes to acknowledge this. This is when you get sort of statements that we're monitoring the situation. That means, we read about it in the newspapers. This is, or in the, we saw it on television. They were not even consulted on this until, they had their only conversations with the United States after the event occurred. The Europeans are non-entities of this, and you saw it also with Keir Starmer, who waited for his reaction until Washington told him what his reaction was. It's pathetic. And everybody is mincing their words, finding some wiggle explanation, like Macron, trying to give two messages in one statement. This is the modern EU. It is ineffective. And, this can have some very, very serious outcomes for the EU. It's not just the way that the EU is seen to be ineffective. Of course, more people see it. We've been saying that for a longer time. The situation is bloody dangerous for the EU. It could lead to some severe disruption, potentially even to members leaving at some point.
Well, and it's not only the global geopolitical scene, it's also at the peripheral level. So let me give you an example. You mentioned Ursula von der Leyen, you mentioned Keir Starmer, we could mention Friedrich Merz. I mean, the sorriest of ramps of apologists of the lack of a strategic plan. But take the Greek Prime Minister, who came up with an utterly self-defeating statement. He comes up with the argument that Maduro had to be taken out. So this is not the time, this is verbatim what the Greek Prime Minister said, this is not the time to think of international law. Immediately, Wolfgang, Turkish politicians and Turkish media and large media organizations came out saying, yes, the Greek Prime Minister, the Prime Minister of a country that has been shielding itself behind the notion of international law, supporting the claims of Greece in the Aegean, in the Eastern Mediterranean and so on, has just said that, we can just set aside international law. So it's, there is a domino effect of what's happening in Venezuela. But look, let's disagree, because there's been too much agreement between us. So I know we disagree on one thing, oil. Now, there's no doubt, we will agree on that American corporations like Chevron and Exxon really want to get their hands on the huge oil reserves of Venezuela. And that Trump has already said that, he has been playing along with that. But, I wonder, and I want your reaction, and there's a disagreement on that. His political base is in Texas, it is in New Mexico, it is in the Permian Basin, it is amongst the frackers who see what's happening in Venezuela now with very, very great discontent. Because let's face it, if all this Venezuelan oil is made available by Chevron and ExxonMobil to the international market, the price of oil is going to come down significantly because there's a lot of it. The supply is going to go through the roof. And price is going to fall below $65 per barrel, permanently or for a very long time. And that would be catastrophic for the shale industry in the United States, which is an important part of the power base of Donald Trump. Why am I saying that? Because I'm not so sure that he's going to let Chevron and ExxonMobil run riot with Venezuelan oil. And that, for me, is one reason why I don't think he wants Machado to come back to Venezuela. Machado, let us remind ourselves, is the Nobel Peace Laureate who was inviting Trump to invade her country. And he said, no, you're a good woman, but you're not presidential material. And he's playing ball now with Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president of Venezuela, who is a well-known lefty. And I think that this may be related to the dilemma that he has. On the one hand, he has to keep Chevron and ExxonMobil happy by promising them Venezuelan oil. But on the other hand, the fracking industry, which is his power base. I mean, watch Landman. I actually enjoy very much Landman with Billy Bob Thornton acting as a typical example of one of those people who are struggling to keep those fracking oil businesses profitable.
I would, agree with a lot of this. Obviously, there's complexity in his power base, but we have to remember the United States does not have a strategy for renewables, unlike China. China's big expansion in energy supply is renewables. Energy is going to play the absolutely most important role in geopolitics going forward for, in the long run. China's expansion is massive. They're already a large oil producer, the United States, but they want to basically dominate the oil market and make it viable for another half century. And Venezuela is part of that long-term strategy. I fully understand the oil reserves that lie dormant in Venezuela. They cannot be easily recouped and recovered. It will require significant investment. I take your point on the fracking industry. We have to remember he doesn't have to get elected anymore. So the power-based argument is more complex for him. He is more likely to lose, power from inside the MAGA movement, which is generally not in favor of global intervention, and which also, in my view, sort of explains that he's sort of done his stunt. He's done it briefly and quickly, and it looked good. And people always support a quick war. But, after day 2 or 3, things get wary and, support drops rapidly. And after a few years, the electorates become extremely critical. So for him, the fact that he's now doing a deal with the old government is completely consistent rather than imposing a new candidate and, becoming sort of responsible for the governance of this country, which is only going to become, which would be a complete mess if they tried. So this is all for this week. We'll be back next week to debunk more orthodoxies.
And don't forget to rate, like, and subscribe The Iconoclasts.